So thank you very much. I'd like to welcome all of you to the first in a series of Science Communication Initiative webinars. I would like to thank the sponsors of the webinars. It's co-sponsored by the Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School's Department of Pathology, Immunology, and Laboratory Medicine, the School of Communication and Information, the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, and the Office of Research and Economic Development. As I said, this is the first in a series of webinars. You will see an opportunity to register for other webinars throughout the semester in just a second. For right now, I'd like to turn it over to Chancellor Malloy, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Alan Leshner.
Thank you very much, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to this virtual seminar about advancing science communications. I don't think there's ever been a year where we needed this more than this year, and I'm very pleased to be here as well. I'd like to thank the group that's initiated this conversation, a group of highly engaged faculty, staff, and students at Rutgers who've come together to advance science, and most particularly the practice of science communication. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, Drs. Bill Hallman and Mary Nucci from the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, Dr. Nick Ponzio from the Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, and Dr. Itzhak Yanovitsky from the School of Communication and Information. And I'd like to thank our keynote speaker and Rutgers alum, Dr. Alan Leshner, for joining us to discuss the importance of science communications, which has very distinct importance now, as I just mentioned, more than ever before. Dr. Leshner is the CEO Emeritus of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and a few of his highlights include being former director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the National Institutes of Health, the Deputy Director and Acting Director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and several roles at the National Science Foundation. He served 2 terms on the National Science Board and what has been appointed by both President Bush and President Obama to those roles. He received his PhD and master's degrees in physiological psychology right here at Rutgers and has earned many distinctions, including the Walsh McDermott Medal from the National Academy of Medicine and 7 honorary Doctor of Science degrees. Dr. Leshner also chaired the National Academy's Committee on the Science of Science Communication, which is the topic for today, which produced a report called Communicating Science Effectively. I am honored to introduce Dr. Leshner to share his perspectives. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm kind of sorry that I'm not there on the campus because it's been many years and I have many of those memories that every student has and sort of cherishes. I am delighted to be here, and as the Chancellor said, this is a time in American history where we've probably needed effective science communication more than ever before, in absolutely every domain, as there are 3 at least converging crises affecting the United States. Each of them can be understood better and can hopefully be dealt with better if science is a part of the communication. So I'm physically incapable of speaking without using slides, and I apologize in advance that I'll have too many slides and I'll speak too fast, but I come from the Northeast and therefore that accounts for my speech pattern. I'm now going to try my first life experience at sharing my screen. I'll put up my talk, I hope. That one. Good. Wake up. Okay, so we've given this the title of broadening the lens and sharpening the focus. And again, there's never been a time in history that we have needed science communication more. I do want to repeat what the Chancellor said. I am a Rutgers alumnus, and therefore when Bill Hallman asked if I would do this, I was particularly pleased to do it. I will confess that I've changed just a bit since my days at Rutgers. I'd like you to meet Alan Leshner as a younger man, and that, of course, has fallen apart over the years. This is where I ended up. I also began as a bench scientist, I spent 12 years in academia. I taught at Bucknell University and did research on the relationship between hormones and behavior. But I turned about 40 years ago into what I think of as somebody interested in the relationship, in the intersection between science and the rest of society, and that's what I want to talk about today. And we'll focus on communicating science with the public. You'll notice that I use the word communicating science with the public as opposed to the public, because as I think we've all learned, it really has to be a dialogue in order to be effective. Okay, so just trying to set a somewhat broader context to begin, we're living, as they say, in rather interesting times. On the one hand, science has been making fantastic progress on many fronts. I think all of us would agree that scientific progress has been accelerating, whether it's incremental science, science that builds on itself, or more transformational science, where in fact scientific discoveries fundamentally change how we think about phenomena. On the other hand, the broader scientific, do you like that? I made that myself, by the way. When you're retired, you don't have anybody. When I was at NIH, I had a bunch of people who put my talks together. Now I'm stuck doing it. So please admire that slide. Notice how it moves. The truth is that we are, in fact, experiencing greater turbulence, greater tension in the science-society relationship than ever before in my scientific lifetime. At times, the public seems ambivalent, indifferent, or even hostile to much of science. I'm sure you've all seen that. But we need the public in order to do our jobs, so that that tense relationship works against us being successful at what we're supposed to do. After all, we only have science for the betterment of humankind. If we don't have the right receptors for our work, who cares about what we do? It doesn't matter. And we need, in turn, the support of the public in order to keep scientific progress going, in order to keep funding for science going. This is my favorite quote in the world. And if you take nothing out of this talk, please memorize this one. Public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So what sets the public's opinion of science? Well, it of course is partly dependent on the rate and form of scientific productivity, how quickly it's converted to useful products and services. It also has to do with the public's view of the quality and trustworthiness of science, and those have sadly been called into question more frequently than any of us would like as of late. And then, of course, the way in which people learned about science when they were in school and how they learned about it, of course, helps shape their opinion. Now, overall, the public both likes and respects science and scientists. This is a study done by a group called Science Counts. The Pew Charitable Trust was involved in this study, and by and large, every study that's ever been done shows that overall the public likes science. And in fact, people respect science. So this is a study done by for the National Science Foundation, the National Science Board, since the early 1970s. And you can see from the slide, if you look at the gold-yellow line, that overall, forever, scientists have been held among the most respected of all professions, just behind the military now. You'll notice that both the press and the Congress have fallen off over time, but we have held our own. And the public generally has a great deal of confidence in scientific leadership. So overall, they like us. How about trust? Trust is an important variable. Well, this is another study done for a group called Science Counts. And overall, you can see, if you just look at the orange and then the lighter brownish orange, look at the brown, look at the arrows, and you'll see that by and large, the majority of the public trusts scientists to tell the truth, to report their findings accurately, to give impartial evidence, and generally, not quite as much, to report their findings even if they go against the sponsor of the research. So overall, the public trusts science, even though many people in the scientific community thinks that's not true. However, things get much more complicated when you get to specific issues. That is, overall, the public trusts science, but when you get down to brass tacks, particularly on specific controversial issues, they're not so sure we get it right. So you get that controversy that breeds less trust and belief in science when you get to issues, for example, that conflict with economic or political convenience. So the issue around climate change isn't about a disagreement about the science. 97% of the scientific community agrees the Earth is warming and people did it. However, it's a big pain in the neck, and it's politically inconvenient because it's expensive, and therefore people feel free just to deny it. Peer group beliefs, that's actually the biggest shaper of people's belief system generally, and in specific about scientific issues. When science conflicts with core values and norms, just an example. So it's not that people don't understand that embryonic stem cells will in fact lead to better diagnostics and better treatments. They do, but they don't like it because it conflicts with their view of when life begins. If you believe that life begins at the moment of conception, as does many religions, then you're taking a life when you harvest embryonic stem cells. If, on the other hand, as other religions believe, life begins at the moment of birth, then embryonic stem cells are okay because you're not taking a life. You only have a life later. Evolution. What phenomenal percentage of the scientific community understands evolution to be a good explanation of how people came to be. However, it can be seen as conflicting with a literal interpretation of the Bible. Therefore, if that's what your religion says, then you object. So the infectious fears one seems to be getting more and more apt as we go on in this pandemic. That is, vaccines, for example, and a frightening percentage of people won't vaccinate their children out of fear that they'll become autistic. However, that belief, that misbelief, is based on one fraudulent study. One study was done that claimed to show that vaccines cause autism. It was later shown to be fabricated and withdrawn. And there have been hundreds of studies showing no relationship between vaccination and autism. But as you all know, infectious fears. GMOs is another example, and I won't go through it in detail. But let me say there is no such thing as GMOs as a generic. People have been genetically modifying crops since the beginning of farming. And so that isn't anything new, but the manipulation of genes through molecular biological techniques seems to be something much more frightening to people. Anyway, that fear, whether or not a particular crop has been found to be safe, has spread, and now there's a whole movement that objects to GMOs. Again, it's based on the conflict with long-held or wide beliefs. And it's known by now, this is that Pew study again, that that members of the public and scientists have discordant views on a whole variety of issues. So if you look at this chart, on the left is the percentage of adults who believe whichever of them, and on the right, scientists. There was a group of AAAS scientists that in fact were studied in this Pew study. And you can see these gaps that are tremendous on the use of animals in research, eating genetically modified foods, humans evolving. 98% of the scientists believe in human evolution, but only 65% of the public. So Atul Gawande wrote a fabulous article in the New Yorker in 2016 about this whole set of issues. And I recommend it to anybody interested in the topic. And I've pulled this quote out of it. There are some others that are terrific. So if you're interested, go look. To defend those long-held beliefs, people dismiss the authority of science, of the scientific community. They argue back by claiming to have a truer scientific authority. So it sort of leads to that thought, you know, don't let the data get in the way of what you think. I'll tell you a sort of personal story. My brother-in-law, who had a PhD in anthropology but became an organic farmer over time. By the way, he was a professor at Livingston College in the old days. He was an organic farmer, and one day he was giving me a lecture on nutrition, and I said, you know, that really is not consistent with the data. I know something about this particular subject, the data shows something else. And to which he replied to me, really? There are data, and then there are data. And I said, no, there are only data. And that was the end. I don't think we ever talked about anything scientific after that. This point actually is very important, and that is that only scientists are stuck with what science says. The rest of the public is free to disregard, deny, or distort findings. That's what's happening with climate change, and there's relatively little consequence. Nobody gets struck by lightning from denying the science, although very sadly at the moment, hundreds of thousands of people have died from the COVID virus who didn't need to die, but people distorted the science or disregarded the science. If I or another scientist does that with scientific findings, lightning strikes, you know, our credibility is gone. But people distort, deny climate change findings all the time, and there are very few immediate consequences. So what do you do about it? How do we deal with this, given the importance of science to modern life? Science is a part of every major issue affecting humanity. The temptation is always to say, well, let's educate them. Those poor, uninformed people don't get it. The truth is, though, that we can't just educate our way out of this situation, because often they do understand and they don't like it. And if they don't like it, they're not stuck with it. Only we're stuck with it. And it's always the case that a conflict with values and beliefs wins over people's views of the societal or scientific benefits. If it conflicts with core values, who needs it? So what do you do about it? Another point from Atul Gawande's article: assert the true facts and explain it, expose bad science tactics. Neither of those, by the way, work terribly well, I'll point out. What works better is something called engaging with the public, and that's what we're embarking on here. Scientists have got to do this. When I was a graduate student and I studied hormones and behavior, you can't, every time I published an article, I'd get a call from a reporter. I studied things like premenstrual tension or hormones and aggression and submission. And my colleagues all said I was wasting time talking to the press or wasting time talking to the public. I should be, sticking to my business and publishing more papers and whatever. But the truth is that has to change. We don't have the luxury anymore of scientists hiding in the lab and keeping their work just to themselves. But when you do that, when we communicate with the public, we have to change the style of what we've done in the past. In the past, we always had these monologues where, we wanted to tell them, we wanted to just teach them. And if we told them over and over, eventually they'd get it. But what we've learned is that that doesn't work. And what we have to do is move to something else, move to a true dialogue with the public, where scientists who are not well accustomed to this have to actually listen to the public and try to find common ground, try to find that place where we in fact can communicate. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating that we try to have a true dialogue with the extremes, with the people at one extreme or at the other extreme. It doesn't work. You can only work with people who are in what I call the rational middle. I'll give you the example of teaching evolution in schools. When that last came up as a very hot issue, I advocated a dialogue with religious communities, engaging with religious communities, engaging with the public widely as a way to get past it and try to keep the teaching of what then was called intelligent design out of science classrooms. I didn't take a position, by the way, on whether you could teach it in a philosophy course. Not my business. I'm the science guy. Keep it out of science classrooms. Keep creationism out of science classrooms so we don't cloak creationism in the guise of science. Now, there's nowhere to go with the extreme right wing of belief in biblical descriptions of creation. Those people are not going to move. Nor, I have to say, will the evangelical atheists who say, no, there is no God and science has proved it. By the way, God is not a scientific question. It's not amenable to scientific investigation. But you can have a dialogue in the middle. And in fact, at AAAS, we had something, they still have it, called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, where in fact, AAAS and the scientific community have been helping evangelical theological seminaries develop science curricula for the ministers, for the pastors, that they educate so that they can have a better understanding of science and dealing with their parishioners. I think that's a tremendous example of communicating with the public. Now, the problem is that effective science engagement is a learned skill, and it's been studied scientifically, and you gotta learn it. You aren't born with it. As good as you think you may be as a communicator, you probably are not very good at this. In fact, I've been working in and around communicating science, as I said, for 40 years. And when I first got to AAAS, I was asked to be on a panel about public engagement with science. And sitting next to me was the newly elected president of a unnamed scientific community that had the acronym FASCB. And he said, my presidential initiative is going to be that every scientist in our society will go out and talk to their neighbors about the work that they do. And without knowing the microphone was on, I inadvertently whispered into it, God forbid. And the truth is, there are many scientists that shouldn't be allowed out in public who don't know how to talk to normal people about their work. But you can learn, and you can learn to do it. And if I had my way, every scientist would have to learn it, because it's essential that the public understand what we do, maybe not in excruciating detail, but at a minimum, they have to know about the enterprise of science, how science is done, what it can and can't tell you, or they'll be left behind in the modern world. And it's our obligation to make sure that our fellow citizens have as fulfilled a life as they can using the science for their benefit. So, as Dr. Hallman said, I had the pleasure of chairing a committee of the National Academy of Sciences on communicating science effectively. It came out a few years ago. In fact, Bill was on the committee, and I'm going to just make a couple of points derived from that, and then some other observations. And I'm going to do this fairly rapidly. And again, I apologize, it's impossible to interrupt because this is probably a point when people have questions. Here we go, some cross-cutting themes. First, it's hard. It's not as easy as one may think. I'm really good at talking to people, I think, but I will tell you I had to learn how to do this. First of all, scientific information is complex and people don't understand what uncertainty is, so they expect absolutes. People process information in a variety of ways, and you need to be able to give them that information in different forms so that they can process it. And of course, as I said, social influences are very powerful. This is probably second to the Lincoln quote, the second most important thing, and that is the long-held view of public education about science is if we just did it better and if we just told them better, they would agree and they would get it. And the truth is, it's not true. You can educate the public forever, and it may or may not work depending on those variables I mentioned before, like their values. And of course, they do need a minimum level of understanding, but they don't have to understand pituitary adrenocortical function, which is what I studied, and which I think was tremendously important, but I think they'll live without understanding that, but they need to understand science. Okay. What the recipient brings to the discussion, where they have been, what their own beliefs are, their analogies, metaphors, etc., and they're watching you the whole time. The environment is extremely complex. We all know that. With the advent of social media, there are many more sources of bad scientific information than they are good scientific information, and it's coming very quickly. Social networks have a big effect on beliefs, attitudes, and behavior, and there aren't people who are able to be gatekeepers on the scientific facts that come through. In the work that we've done with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, there's been a big effort to try to figure out how to do it, and we have failed miserably. And so anybody has a good way to figure out how to be a gatekeeper of scientific facts on websites, that would be tremendously helpful. I alluded to this before. People hate uncertainty. Science, by its very nature, is uncertain. It's true. 97% of the public believes the Earth is warming and people did it. What about that 3%? I think those 3% may be right. They don't understand the concept of uncertainty. All of science is uncertain. We can't have certainty because we don't know the future. How the issue is framed or presented is critical. That's sort of self-evident, but you'd be amazed how many people try to just drop the findings onto people. This is my favorite word, glocal. I actually learned it a number of years ago from a woman who was the director of the Mexico City Science Museum, Maria Tegenia, and I Thought it was her accent, to be honest, but it's a very important concept. And what it basically says is you have to take a global issue and make it locally meaningful, make it personally meaningful to the individual. The truth is, people only care about issues that affect them personally or affect them locally. And therefore, we have to find a way to make whatever it is personally meaningful. This is also very important. In-person engagement works best, and there are a variety of ways you could do it. In fact, talking to your neighbors over your backyard fence is good. Group problem solving. What doesn't work are those giant town meetings and big public lectures that we are prone to do. We think it's a great idea to have a big educational seminar. When I was the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I actually had 14 town meetings around the country where I or another scientist would get up and talk about the latest science about drug addiction. And then what would happen is that the extremes from one side or the other would grab the microphones and yell at each other about how wrong the other was. The truth is that studies have been done of big public lectures and town meetings with important scientists giving speeches, and they have very little effect on public view. In contrast to me haranguing you, engage with, don't harangue the public. Telling them over and over doesn't help. It's sort of like dealing with your children. You always think, if I tell them once and then I'll tell them again, oh, you didn't get it? I'll tell you again. Okay. People love stories. So another important variable is to make it into a story. You know, if you look at newspapers, including articles about scientific findings, it almost always begins with a story. People are engaged by stories, and if there's a way you can make the discovery, the finding, whatever it is you want to communicate, into some context, that works very well. This one I love. Hyperbole is the enemy of credibility, exaggerating. For many years in the drug abuse business, you know, people would use the metaphor that drugs fry brains. Of course, drugs don't fry brains. But I couldn't get rid of it. As the NIDA director, I worked with the Partnership for Drug-Free America to stop using that egg frying on a frying pan as the metaphor, and it has no effect. Studies that have been done show that. This one is a tough one for scientists. Scientists love the nuances that go with their findings. They like to have a clause, but people only hear the first part, the soundbite. So I'm the guy who brought you addiction is a brain disease. But the truth is, addiction, before that, schizophrenia is a brain disease. I'm sure that Johnny OneNote. I didn't actually say that, but both have been attributed to me. Mostly addiction is a brain disease. The scientific community didn't actually like me saying it's a brain disease because it's more complicated than that. And eventually I took to saying addiction is a brain disease, comma, expressed in behavioral ways and in a social context. Nobody ever heard the clause. The only thing that has ever been quoted is addiction is a brain disease. You have to be aware of that. My new dither, based on a survey I just heard about literally 3 days ago, is that the word science isn't easy for people to relate to. They can relate to specific content, but not to science. Now, that's very hard for advocates. You know, people who work to try to promote science funding, for example. People don't know what you're talking about when you say, give more money to science. What? Why should I? What is science? And it's important to realize that there has to be a way to concretize it, make it mean something concrete or be in a concrete domain. So let me end by saying we're learning more and more about what works and doesn't, and we've got to use it. We have to have science replace intuition, common sense, and everybody's own view of how to go about this. And we need more of it, so please, let's have more. Okay, I think I'll stop at that point. I have no idea how we do Q&A, but I hope we have time, and I hope I've inflamed somebody so that we can have a vibrant conversation. So, Bill, do you know how to do this?
I do. So thanks very much, Alan, for a very stimulating talk. Now we'd like to go to the discussion piece, and I invite those who are participating, and there are more than 90 people participating right now. I invite you to type some questions into the Q&A box. So please do that, and I will moderate and pose the questions to Dr. Leshner. And so Dr. Leshner, the first question is there a primer on beneficial points for scientists to use or remember some pearls when talking with the public about science? Well, I think you've given us some. Are there other places to go?
So, as I said, the National Academy of Sciences has done a variety of stuff. The Chancellor mentioned Alan Alda, by the way. He and I have done some work together, and we refer to each other as the other Alan. His center at SUNY Stony Brook is filled with great points about communicating science with the public. AAAS has a website that has many resources that can help people figure out what works and doesn't work and what can make you do it better. In fact, AAAS has a training program where, unfortunately, I think they've suspended it during the pandemic, but where they send out sort of this flying squad that goes to universities and trains scientists. They've trained, I don't know, 6,000 or 8,000 scientists over time in how to communicate with the public. So there are resources available that can help. Dr. Hallman?
Sorry, and Alan, you did address this second point. How do you address religious beliefs that run counter to science? You did touch on that, but I'll give you an opportunity to respond.
So, first of all, science has nothing to say about God. That's an important starting point. Scientists have to understand and be a little bit humble about what science can and can't answer. So, as the great physicist Leon Letterman used to say, before the Big Bang, it's all up for grabs. We don't know really what caused the origin of the universe, and it's not amenable to scientific question. That's point one. Secondly, you are not going to change the mind of people who have deep-seated religious beliefs. What I recommend that you do is engage on some other topic, find some common ground, and slowly see if there's a way. So I'm Jewish, and the rabbi in the synagogue we belong to decided to talk about the creation story as a metaphor for evolution. Who was right? Who was wrong? You know, he sort of danced around it, but you can't force people to violate their core beliefs or their core values. It's not going to happen. So there is no hint as to how to do that. You just have to find common ground, and then you can agree to disagree. You don't have a choice.
Great. This question's from my colleague Xenia Morin. We often call on science for policymaking before the science is clear. Is timing or the mistiming of relevant scientific information critical good scientific scientific communication? Do we need to get better at anticipating what information will be needed by society so we can be relevant in real time? I think that's a leading question, Alan.
I wish we could do that. We stink at that. So everybody wants to do the foresight studies that tell you what the next issue will be. And nobody is good at that. Nobody can look into the future accurately, but you can get a sense of issues that either are recurrent, so infectious disease is a good example of that. And we could ask plenty of scientific questions about how to do a better job dealing with infectious diseases as they emerge. So that's one thing. And then, you know, more and more people are studying how to look at sort of burgeoning things. Now, in policymaking, you don't get a choice. You have to, I believe, be very clear about what you know, what you don't know, and what you might know. Because if you lie to a policymaker, it's over. At the same time, it's very important to respect their context. So I'll tell you a funny story. When I was the NIDA director, I wanted to introduce the medication buprenorphine, which is now used by millions of people, into physicians' offices. And so buprenorphine is what's known as a partial agonist for heroin. And, you know, it partially blocks the receptor, and it's got some other characteristics. And all of a sudden, Senator Carl Levin from Michigan called me up and said, I want you to come talk to me about this new heroin blocker that you want to get into doctors' offices. Before that, all treatments for heroin were done in methadone clinics. So I went to see him, and he said, so what about this new heroin blocker? And I said, Senator, it's not a heroin blocker per se. It's a partial agonist, and it has this characteristic and that characteristic. He said, oh, good. Okay, great. But you want it in doctors' offices. I said, it's critical, because then millions of people could be treated who wouldn't be willing to go to methadone clinics. The next day, he gets up on the floor of the Senate and he says, there's this new heroin blocker that we have to get out into physicians' offices. I, of course, was dying while I was watching it on C-SPAN, because he called it a heroin blocker, and then it passed by voice vote. There was a resolution, and it had a big part in eventually getting widespread acceptance. So you got to know what you know and what you don't know, but then when a policymaker translates it into their own language, you have to be willing to let them do it. That was an important lesson for me. Okay.
Thanks. We have lots and lots of questions to pose.
Okay, I'll
I'm gonna have to cherry pick a little bit here. Can you talk a bit about balancing being upfront about uncertainties involved in your research versus avoiding nuance? And
you have to have a bottom line point that you want to make. You have to have a top line point and a bottom line point. You know, I've written a lot of editorials in Science magazine, and the editor who handles those, the best editor in the whole world, named Lisa Chung, would always say to me, you get one paragraph to get my attention. Get my attention, and then at the end of it, you better tell me what you want me to do. And the truth is, you give them the main point. Then you can caveat it a little bit. You can't caveat it a lot. And then you got to shut up. And that's the secret. Shutting up is the hard part.
for many of us.
Okay,
So the next question, what are some ways to respond to people who say, leave politics out of science?
I'm in favor of leaving politics out of science. I don't want politics, especially with a big P, but including with a little p. I don't think science should be affected by politics. And I think when scientists take openly political points of view, either they have to find a magic way to not be a scientist when they do it, or to make sure you're only talking about political influence on science. So if for political reasons a policymaker compromises the integrity of science, I will stand up and yell. And I think we all should stand up and yell and say, you are violating the integrity of science. That is not accurate scientifically. Look what Fauci is doing. Tony Fauci is the master at getting accurate information out to the public. And not without, I'm sure, personal cost. But when, for political reasons, science is being compromised, I think we all need to stand up and protest. Sometimes it doesn't work, in case you haven't noticed.
Great. Another question. It seems like an obvious extension of science communication is in educating the public to be savvy consumers of scientific research themselves. Have you found success with this approach? Are there any pearls of wisdom you can offer here?
Say that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. The question is essentially, have you found success in teaching consumers to be more savvy at being consumers of scientific research itself?
That's a great question. And the answer is, I don't have a magic trick, but I think it's much more important for people to understand about science, what science can and can't tell you, and what constitutes scientific evidence. So if you're talking to people about something, for example, most people have no idea what a clinical trial is, but we want people to respect clinical trials and expect clinical trials. So I think when talking about a medical finding or a medication, I think we should be very clear that we say to people, you know, we know that to be effective because it was subjected to a clinical trial. This is, and you get 2 sentences, this is what a clinical trial is. I think understanding the process is very important.
Great. A couple of questions from some students. Could you describe your approach for prioritizing scientific communications to the public? For instance, the COVID-19 pandemic is first and foremost in the minds of many, yet climate change is still increasingly present as well. How do you balance communicating ongoing important issues with emerging acute crises in a way that maximizes receptivity without overwhelming your audience?
That's a fabulous question. I don't have a good answer to that because most scientists only have expertise about a limited number of things. And therefore they, they'll talk about those things. And by the way, scientists shouldn't talk about things they don't know anything about. So what you have to do is to learn as much as you can about whatever you're going to talk about, and then stick to the question at hand. You don't get to throw in, when somebody wants to know about COVID, you don't get to throw in, oh no, by the way, while I have your attention, here's a little climate change, just to keep you interested. Stick to the topic, know what you're there to talk about, and talk about that topic. I don't know if I answered your question, but I hope so.
Here's a question from a colleague in nutritional sciences. There are many poor books on nutrition, diets, and health in the lay publishing world. How do we combat authors who are writing inaccurate books and making lots of money? People always want to hear about a single pill that will make them healthy. They do not wish to change their lifestyles, which is harder.
All you can do is try to publish the right stuff. There's a limit to how many or how you can actually get rid of the bad stuff. I've tried and have only failed. So I don't think there's a simple way to do it, but you can in fact out-truth them. You can provide more information. The problem is that most scientific findings take a long time to become accepted. So when I was a beginning assistant professor, we taught in psychology courses that schizophrenia was caused by schizophrenic mothers and refrigerator parents. That was the belief at the time. Science has shown that that is nonsense. That is just flat out wrong. Schizophrenia is a brain disease. It has genetic components, has environmental components, but in fact, it involves changes in brain structure and function. It took forever for that to get wider acceptance. Now, if you say schizophrenic mothers, nobody knows what you're talking about, or they laugh. But that took decades before it was, and in many cases, like COVID, we don't have decades. We need people to trust the science. That's a scary thought, but they need to do it. Go ahead.
Another question. The CDC, one of the most esteemed science institutes in the world, is withdrawing statements that SARS-CoV-2 can be aerosolized and is airborne under unknown pressures. What do we do when the CDC is losing credibility? This seems to be a problem for public health.
So it's not unique to the CDC. There are plenty of other organizations that go through those same kinds of gyrations. This goes back to an earlier question. We should give the most accurate information we have at the time. If we don't have enough information to say something, do not say it definitively. And Fauci experienced this early on. I don't remember the specific topic, but early on he said A. Later he said A-. And then some politician, not the president, some politician decided that then he had no credibility because he went from A to a, slightly different version of the same thing. Well, science progresses, and we have to tell people science changes its mind, but you have to be careful not to be prematurely definitive. And that goes for agencies as well for individual scientists. In that particular case, there is a question, and I'm not taking a position on it, but there's a question as to whether all of that happened as a result of political pressure. If that's true, that's terrible. It's a violation of scientific integrity and it should never happen, but I have no way to know whether that's actually true.
Thanks. A couple of questions about modalities. This from a student. Do you see interactive and web-based technology playing a larger role in scientific communication?
So those technologies have more and more, but they also enable garbage to be transmitted as well as good scientific information or valid scientific information. And so that poses a very difficult problem, right? How do you keep the trash out and just have the good stuff? Nobody's been able to figure that out particularly well, but it would be good if we could figure that out. I think we would all like that. One of the things is that social media has opportunities and ways of monitoring what gets put up, and I wish that they would be more careful about it. And if something is obviously wrong, take it down. But I don't get to decide those things.
Alan, you mentioned the importance of engagement and storytelling to communicate science. Do you have any examples of storytelling partnerships between scientists and non-scientists that you found to be successful?
Yep. So the best advocates for science, certainly for biomedical science, are patients. There is nothing more powerful than a patient coming in and saying, I have X, my life was miserable, and science saved it. That works. Me going in and saying, love my science, is better than nothing, but not a lot. And so people who have personal experiences who can transmit that is much more meaningful. It makes it personally meaningful or locally meaningful. And so partnering with organizations works great. You know, Vint Cerf, one of the developers of the internet, is a master, works now for Google, is a master of talking to people about the internet in understandable ways. And often he will do it by recruiting users of the internet to talk along with him. Very effective.
Great. You made a distinction between science communication as an exchange with audiences rather than to audiences. What are ways scientists can incorporate knowledge, experience, and expertise from audiences to inform science and science communication? Do you have any examples of this being done well?
Yes. One good example is this dialogue on science, ethics, and religion that AAAS has, which started out very controversial and frankly not very effective. But by bringing together groups of, in their case, evangelical leaders or religious leaders with scientists to talk about science, to talk about scientific questions they have, it really gives you a much better understanding of where the religious leaders are coming from so that you can talk to them better and make your work more meaningful to them. And it gives them a sense that you're human and that you are actually not the arrogant person in the Ivy Tower. I never know if it's Ivy Tower or Ivory Tower. It's some tower. One of the biggest problems that scientists have is they ain't loaded with humility. And some humility is necessary in effective dialogue with anybody about anything, but that's true as well.
Thanks. I'm going to combine two questions. One, do women or men have more challenges in becoming effective science communicators? Does the public trust men more? And then the follow-up is, how important do you think diversity among science communicators is when considering message delivery approaches and audience characteristics for scientific issues? So gender and diversity.
So both are very important, but what's most important depends on the audience to whom you're speaking. I can tell you that in speaking to a primarily Black audience, to bring a distinguished Black scientist is much more effective than old white guys like me, because people relate differently, relate better. And often, in my experience, people from diverse groups are much more effective in knowing how to talk to them. When I was at NIDA, we developed I don't know what you would call it, but we called it a group. Anyway, called the National Hispanic Science Network, and it was led by an array of the best Hispanic scientists in the United States. And I had all these materials that we were putting out for the public that I thought we should translate into Spanish. So they said not only was my Spanish lousy, but that the Spanish translations had to be made more appropriate for different Hispanic communities, more Latino communities. But even the graphics weren't conducive. So there's this old adage, know before whom you stand, know before whom you're speaking. And the more you can relate on their terms, the better it will work. And that's true whether it's gender, ethnicity, whatever it is. The more relatable you are, the more effective you are.
Excellent. I think that is a great place to end the Q&A. We will sit, there are 33 questions, Alan. So
Good.
we're going to save the questions for you and send them to you. So just a couple of minutes on the Science Communication Initiative here at Rutgers. As we mentioned, Alan is our keynote speaker for a series of webinars that will transpire over the remainder of the semester. I want to talk just a few minutes about the initiative itself. Many of you who are logged on are already members of the initiative, and thank you for that. Our overarching mission is to really enhance the coordination, effectiveness, and visibility of interdisciplinary science communication efforts at Rutgers. And if you've not already joined the initiative, I invite you to do that. The web address is below. It's very easy to remember. It's scicom.rutgers.edu. So why Rutgers? Well, we have a long history of excellence in science communication. We, of course, are the land-grant institution. It is our duty to share the science that we know with the public. We have significant expertise on campus. So Rutgers is in a really terrific position to take this on. Why now? Alan alluded to this. There is a great demand for science communication, perhaps more now than ever. There is a terrific opportunity. There are many, many issues that science can be brought to bear on. So it's important for us to be talking about science. We do have a responsibility as the land grant to be doing this. And there is available support from a number of foundations, from the National Science Foundation itself and others, to engage in science communication, to teach people how to talk with communities about science. So why advance the science and practice of science communication? As Alan already said, the public and the scientific community can both benefit when scientists engage. Unfortunately, very few scientists have had formal training in communicating science. Those of us who do it, most of us rely on our intuitions and experience. And often that experience and those intuitions come from the classroom, which is not necessarily the best training ground for discussing science, either with the public and particularly with policymakers. Intuitions, even informed by experience, aren't always right. Those of us who do this have found out this the very hard way. So we need to use scientific principles to determine how best to communicate about science. There is, of course, an emerging science of science communication. Alan talked about communicating science effectively. This is a good place for many of you to start. I urge you to download this report. It's free from the National Academy of Sciences. And if you do so, you will join the nearly 34,000 other people who have downloaded that report. So it's a very good overview of communicating science. As Alan said, we do need to go beyond the deficit model. In this model, the task of communication is simply to explain the facts to the public, to do it louder, to do it clearer, to use graphs. Unfortunately, we know that real-life science communication doesn't really work that way. So what are we talking about then? If we're not talking about the deficit model, you know, science communication is more than just helping people understand facts. It goes beyond simple messaging. You know, many of us are taught that science communication is simply finding a better way to explain what you found, why the audience should care about what you found, what you did find, and to generate some excitement among the public, among your audience for what it is that you have discovered. Science communication is much more than that, and I find that while we need to do some of that, often that is very much self-promotion rather than helping the public really understand the issues that would be helpful to them. Overall, science communication is pragmatic. When we're talking about science communication, we're talking about a number of different goals. Goals to inform the public, yes. To educate them, yes. Sometimes to alert them. But as was asked in an earlier question, often we need to use science communication to anticipate societal needs or individual needs. We need to listen to the public. We need to engage. We need to empower. We need to use science communication to debunk nonsense, to inform decisions, to raise questions, to invite debate. And when it's necessary, we need to use science to help persuade people and perhaps mobilize people to take action. And here we get into the realm of what is science and what is politics, which is an interesting discussion. We've also maintained that science communication is interdisciplinary. So we're using the term science communication as an umbrella term to mean many, many things. Crisis communication, risk communication, health comm, environmental comm, public health issues, patient-provider issues, involving the social sciences, the political sciences, journalism, science narrative, formal science ed, informal science ed, and so forth. All of this is science communication. I did have the great privilege of serving with Alan on the committee that wrote Communicating Science Effectively. And one of the key sentences that I am most proud of in that book is on page 19. It says, the committee believes that while scientists have a duty to speak about their work, they have an equal duty to listen. And what we need to understand is that science communication isn't simply delivering messages, it's often listening to the public. I was interviewed last week about communicating about COVID-19 and was really pleased that the quote was picked up. We need to understand the reasoning behind people's decisions to act in a certain way, and we need to start with their beliefs, not ours. The only way to understand their beliefs is to ask them, is to interact with people, and rather than assume that you know what is best for folks. So the goals of the initiative. One is to improve curricular programs in science communication across disciplines, beginning at Rutgers. To advance innovative research in the science of science communication at Rutgers. To train existing and emerging professionals in its practice. And fundamentally to develop a synergistic community of faculty, students, staff, and postgraduates who can communicate about science with diverse publics, including policymakers and potential donors, with an overarching goal of promoting science communication research, teaching, training, and outreach at Rutgers that is fundamentally interdisciplinary, collaborative, and coordinative, and will build bridges between faculty, departments, schools, and campuses. We need everyone together, moving forward together to advance the science and practice of science communication. It's also important to note that the initiative builds from the ground up. We are indeed a network of engaged faculty from across the university who have already joined the initiative and are contributing their expertise, interests, and energies. Again, we hope many of you on this, this telecast will join us at scicom.rutgers.edu. The initiative also builds on existing strengths and opportunities in education, research, training, and outreach. There is an existing science communication minor. There are a number of science communication grad classes across the university. We are collecting information about those particular courses. And in the future, we envision a graduate program, perhaps a professional master's program, workshops, certificates, end of semester presentations, training students to do that. There is already individual research to advance the science and practice of science communication. There is applied research going on at Rutgers regarding specific issues and how to improve science communication. We are already connecting social scientists with STEM and public health and medical professionals to help them with their research and in writing grants to NSF and NIH. And in the future, we do foresee an interdisciplinary center for science communication that would make this easier and more formal. With outreach, we are the home for Rutgers Cooperative Extension. We are the land grant. We've been doing this for 100 years. We have citizen science that we're engaged in. We're engaged in science cafes, public programs in K through 12, informal science ed. And in the future, we're looking forward to greater opportunities to have science cafes with the public in more places than just New Brunswick and the university. We're looking forward to teaching students and faculty and staff to engage in podcasting and filmmaking, and of course, recurring training programs for faculty, staff, and students to help them communicate with the public and with policymakers. So we're building on existing strengths and opportunities. With this, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Mary Nucci, who is going to talk briefly about some of the educational opportunities. Mary?
Thank you, Bill. I don't have a screen share, so it's just going to be me up here. So I'll just take a few minutes to talk about the undergraduate opportunities, programs, and activities we're focused on. As Bill mentioned, this is an interdisciplinary group of individuals. So when I speak, work that I've particularly done, but really in reality, it's work that we have done across the campuses and across the university, engaging people who are interested in promoting science communication at the undergraduate level. The initiative really grew out of a kind of chance meeting with Nick Ponzio, he'll speak after me, and then of course Bill Hallman and I have been colleagues for years, all recognizing that there was a need to really address the issues of science communication, and this series is to take those issues and turn them into action. So I want to tell you what we've been doing, where I've been focused on the undergraduate, Bill is really focused on the graduate level, and Nick is focused on the training. So I'm going to talk about what I've been doing for the last 10 years and just put it in some context to say that I left the laboratory and went into museums thinking that I could just hand people science textbooks and slides, because that was way pre-internet, and everybody would love it. And I realized very quickly that that wasn't the way to communicate science. So that when I joined Rutgers 10 years ago, I've really, for my courses that I teach, I've really taken them away from very focused theory kind of teaching classes. We're not focused on theory. We do have theory, to really turn it around to more of a skills action level, where we understand that we need to prepare students to be critical consumers of science content. We want them to engage in a contextual matter through storytelling or filmmaking or some way to connect science to people that they get really excited about it, as well as understand the audience that they're going to speak with. So Alan referenced a lot of that. So it really has taken all the knowledge that has been developed over the years by other researchers and by Rutgers researchers that say that if we wanted people to be good communicators, they need to know their audience, they need to know how to talk to them, they need to tell a good story, and they themselves have to be critical consumers. We also recognize that students at undergraduate level, not everyone's going to be a science communicator, not everyone wants to go out to the public and talk about science, they may not even have science as their direct career, but we want them to be critical consumers so that they can look at the news around COVID. They can look at the news around climate change and say, I know that this is appropriate and this is not appropriate. So again, we've moved my courses in particular from theory-based to action or skills-based courses, but we have a broader network of faculty, staff, and students that are in the initiative. And what we've really attempted to build at the undergraduate level is this cross-disciplinary interaction, collaboration that we can promote science communication training for students, regardless of whether they're necessarily in science or not. So that, for example, our largest department at the university is biology. We have strong connections to great relationship with the biology department, working together across disciplines. We work with Mason Gross School of the Arts, and Nick Ponzio is going to reference that a little bit, but we now have an undergraduate class that has taken the improv training that Dave Dannenfelser, who is a colleague on the initiative, has extended beyond that of the Alan Alda program. He's done some neat changes to that. Nick's going to talk about that a little bit, but we now have an undergraduate class. We have connections to the honors programs, and we have connections across the 5 universities. Since most people here, I think, are familiar with Rutgers, we have connections from Newark to Camden, and that's really nice that we have people who are engaged with undergraduates who recognize that we need to change the way we communicate or teach communication to them. We look at science communication as both an accompaniment and as a way to excel at the university. So Bill mentioned we have a minor in science communication that really prepares students to be really for disciplinary communication. We also have a minor in science outreach, which prepares them for informal ed, museums, just talking to the public or corporate and nonprofit organizations. And I think the big thing that I would like you to take away from what we're doing at Rutgers with science communication for undergraduates is to recognize that it should be integral, that any student, regardless of whether they're teaching science, should have some sense of what effective science communication is. And we tie it into real world action. So it's not writing a paper that you read at the end of the semester and then it gets filed in either the circular file in your office or in the recycle bin on your computer, but it's something where students can actually create work that is real world, has real world application, and provides them with a sense of accomplishment that when they go out to an employer, they can say, oh yeah, I took a course in science communication. Rather they say, yes, I took this course in science communication and my work is online. It's being used by this nonprofit, or I've created this activity or this program, so that they recognize that it's working to create something to promote science communication understanding in the audience beyond the school. And in the future, we want to continue to engage across our network. And again, as Bill said, we hope many of you would join us, especially if you're interested in undergraduate or education or programs, that we want to create greater opportunities for students that they can engage with the outside world with real world work that will prepare them for their careers. It will promote cross-disciplinary conversations. We're looking at new formats for how we communicate science. We're looking at visual communication, nonfiction storytelling. We already have a lot of these things in place, but you just want to extend it and welcome students from wherever they are, that they can come to Rutgers, get a grounding in science communication, and leave here being critical consumers as well as effective science communicators themselves. So again, if this is an interest of anybody, I'd love you to join us. Please join the initiative, and we will continue to, I think, place Rutgers on the map of recognizing that we need to anticipate the needs of the public for science communication, as one of the questions asked, and as well as prepare them for their careers and the wicked problems that we are facing forward in the future with issues like climate change and infection control and all those issues that we deal with every day. So thank you, Bill, for that. And I think we're going to hand it over to Nick now. So Nick.
Can I unmute?
You should be able to, let me see.
Okay. So hello, everybody. I want to add my welcome and thanks to Alan Leshner for speaking and everyone who's joined us today. I'm kind of the outsider. I'm in the Newark campus of Rutgers Biomedical and Health Sciences in the Department of Pathology and Immunology at New Jersey Medical School. And first and foremost, I'm a scientist. The majority of my research has been related to cancer immunology. I teach immunology to medical students, dental students, as well as PhDs, masters, postdocs, and fellows and residents. And I've trained numerous PhDs in my research lab for the past couple of decades. I have always tried to teach immunology and to communicate my research clearly, accurately, and most importantly, understandably to with an audience in mind as I design my talks. But I've noticed two things over the years that I've been teaching and doing research. First of all, our PhD students, postdoctoral fellows, residents are doing cutting edge research with outstanding faculty mentors. Secondly, they can do a much better job of telling people not only what the research is about, but also why it's important and how it impacts the audience they're speaking to. But I had no formal training in science communication. I was just, as Bill mentioned, winging it, doing what I thought was best. So how do I learn how to help our students learn how to communicate better? Well, as Alan Leshner said, I went to the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. I took a sabbatical. I was a visiting professor. I helped them teach courses, and in the process learned their methods. And I brought those back to Rutgers. I got a small grant from the borough's Welcome Fund to develop a course. Tough to come up with a name, but we called it Communicating Science. I recruited people like Mary and some other scientists, as well as educators, someone from the School of Communication and Information, and the person Mary mentioned, Dave Dannenfelser, who's at the Mason Grove School of the Arts and is our guru for improvisation, which is one of the things that is incorporated by courses that at the Alan Alda Center. And we've incorporated it into our Communicating Science course. But as Mary said, Dave goes beyond just the improvisational part. It's really teaching our students how to present in a way that's engaging the audience. Dave is an actor, he's a playwright, he appreciates the audience perspective on this. So we gave the course the first time in the spring semester of 2017, and we've given it every spring semester since then. It's very successful. Students like it a lot. They learn a lot. Students who thought they were good communicators have told us that they've learned so much by taking this course that now they've incorporated a lot of the methods they've learned into their talks going forward. And there's been a couple of spin-offs from the original course, including graduate level, master's level courses on communicating science, one in Piscataway campus, one in the Newark Rutgers Biomedical Health Sciences campus. And in all of these courses and the other spin-off is a workshop series that Dave Dannenfelser and I give. We have a PhD course, we have a master's course. The workshop series are for postdocs, residents, and even faculty to incorporate some of these learning opportunities. And we teach 5 things in all of these courses and workshops. First, we help our learners identify the central message that defines their research. Second, we teach them how to know their audience, how to engage their audience, which is so critically important. Third, we show them how to minimize the scientific jargon that sometimes is a barrier for audience understanding the science when it's so complex. Fourth, as Alan said in his talk, we teach them how to tell a story about their science. The story is so engaging. It's transitional in terms of getting your message across. And finally, it's practice, 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 making adjustments, practicing until the students are comfortable and confident about what they want to say, but also how they can say it. And along the way of developing the courses and workshops, Mary, Bill, and I came together to develop this science communication initiative to form this community of practice, to raise awareness about the need for more science communication, training, collaborative research, and outreach at Rutgers University. So I endorse what Bill said of encouraging you to go to our website, become an affiliate member of the initiative, and join our efforts to strengthen science communication at Rutgers. And we also hope to see you next month at the October webinar. So I'm going to hand it back over to Bill to wrap things up.
Great, thanks very much. And let me just briefly share my screen. So this, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the list of future seminars coming up. There is one in October on graduate students' experience and perspectives on science comm, another in November on teaching science comm, another in December on engaging diverse audiences with science. We will have a program in the spring as well, which we're developing, and we invite your interest and your suggestions and your participation in that. Again, if you're interested in registering for any of these upcoming webinars, go to scicomm.rutgers.edu.